Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, but more specifically, we're going to be discussing the Bitcoin dominance. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We have basically been spending the last several years building out this Into the Cryptoverse website where you essentially have thousands of different charts on cryptocurrencies, equities, and the macroverse. And I do think it provides a lot of information for a lot of these different sectors. I know I don't really spend a ton of time talking about altcoins on the channel these days. One of the reasons, of course, is just because I'm in the Bitcoin dominance is going higher camp. So I would prefer to preserve the Satoshi valuation of my portfolio just by mainly just sticking with Bitcoin until looser monetary policy arrives, and then kind of seeing which ones are sort of holding up. But just know that there are a lot of charts on the website for the altcoin market, even if you don't see me talking about them recently on the YouTube channel. Now, I know full well that by making a Bitcoin dominance video right now, it is kind of risky, especially given the theoretical imminent approval of a spot Ethereum ETF, right? I get that. And again, I don't make these videos to tell you what I think is going to happen tomorrow. I make these videos to think about, this is where I think the general market direction is going. Of course, it's going to likely be a stochastic process to get there. I also said, repeatedly that I ultimately don't think the spot ETF for ETH will necessarily keep the ETH Bitcoin valuation from staying at relatively low levels. And I know there's going to be a lot of criticism for that, and I mean I can deal with that. That's fine. But if you think back, there's been so many narratives that have been given out over the last few years as to why the ETH Bitcoin valuation would never go to even the current levels that it's at, right? If you had asked someone back in 2022 when ETH Bitcoin was at 0.08, if you had told them that it was going to go down into the mid 0.04s by 2024, they would have laughed at you because they said deflationary tokenomics and, this transition from proof of work to proof of stake. At the end of the day, I don't have any issues with Ethereum. I think that it's likely going to do well in the future. My only thought process as it relates to the ETH Bitcoin valuation is that we had these narratives about the transition from proof of work to proof of stake on this deflationary mechanism theoretically causing the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation to quote unquote hold up well, and that didn't play out, right? And so it sort of gave us a glimpse into the idea that, hey, maybe this is more about monetary policy than it is about anything else. And so I just want to remind people that yes, the spot ETF for ETH is launching soon, more than likely, but I still want to go through a scenario that maybe a lot of people aren't actually considering, okay? So the first thing let's do is let's just see where Bitcoin dominance is, right? So as at the time of this video, it's at 54.5%, which is remarkable considering how fearful people are about Bitcoin dominance right now. I mean, I've seen a lot of people, basically give up on it, but in reality, where it is right now is basically where it was struggling to break through for the better part of half a year. If you look at this chart, you will see that Bitcoin dominance had a really hard time breaking through 54% in any durable fashion. Every time it got close, it was just a wick. And of course, that changed right before the halving, which is when we said we would likely see another spike in Bitcoin dominance. And you can see that after the halving, Bitcoin dominance has held at 54%. Furthermore, not only has it held at 54%, but it is still trending above its bull market support band, which again consists of the 20-week SMA and the 21-week EMA. Now, instantaneously, it is below the 20-week moving average. If you look at the 20-week moving average of Bitcoin dominance, it's at 54.59%, and we're currently at 54.51%. The 21-week EMA, however, is at 54.38%, which is slightly lower than at least the time that I'm making this video. Do note that while Bitcoin dominance has spent the majority of its time trending above the bull market support band since late 2022, there have been a few instances where it actually did go slightly below it for a few days, maybe a week or so, but mostly it has just trended higher. So I want to think about, where is Bitcoin dominance now? 54.5%. But what is the argument for it to go higher, right? And I think some of the best arguments for it to, for that people might give for it to stall out, and honestly, I don't even know if I've seen a lot of these arguments quantified. I just see people say things based on what happened last cycle. But one of the things that you could argue is a headwind for Bitcoin dominance. I do think it will overcome it, let me be clear. But one thing that you might say is something that it's going to struggle with is just that seasonality aspect. If you were to look, in fact, at, say, 2024 Bitcoin dominance, let's not even look at 2024, just look at 2020 and 2016. You can see that kind of around these summer months, the Bitcoin dominance hasn't really done that well, right? It really hasn't. But look at 2024. This is dominance without stablecoins. I mean, you really can see that it has trended higher for basically the entire year. Again, this is dominance excluding stablecoins. It's been putting in higher lows essentially all year long. And if you look at other examples, you can see that there were periods in sort of the first half of the year where it was putting in higher lows, but it was after a massive sort of drop by Bitcoin dominance early on. Whereas this time, the drop by Bitcoin dominance at the beginning of the year was actually relatively muted. You see that? It wasn't that big of a drop. So I'm not suggesting that there can't at all be any type of pullback by Bitcoin dominance, right? I mean, you can even see that around this time, there can be some weakness, and that would actually correspond, that would line up very well with the launch of the spot ETH ETF, right? But in the same way that there was weakness back over here by Bitcoin dominance in prior halving years, you can see that this halving year, that weakness by dominance was a lot more muted, right? It wasn't nearly as weak as it normally is in the early part of the halving year. And so while, again, there could be some weakness around this time, sort of that July, June, July timeframe, at least by looking at prior halving years, even if there is, I would still assume that it will likely trend back up in the fourth quarter of the year. You see that? What you'll notice is that in the last couple of halving years, Bitcoin dominance. I mean, look, right now it's on what day number? We're on day 192 right now. So if you look at prior years, you can see a local low was found on day 215 in the 2016 cycle. If you look at the last cycle, 2020, you can see a local low was found on day 246. So I think there is a case to be made that whatever pullbacks there might be will likely be over sometime in the next month or so. Okay. And I say that not just for seasonality purposes, right? Again, if you look at seasonality of Bitcoin dominance, it looks like there's this weakness, there's this vulnerability by it in halving years, basically around this time, which again, everyone's going to just look at the spot ETF and say that's the reason, right? But it's normally trending down at this point for at least a few weeks. But as I said previously, the weakness that you saw in the last two halving years by dominance, we haven't really seen that this year. In fact, in prior halving years, dominance excluding stables barely stayed above 1 in terms of the ROI from the start of the year, right? If you look at both the prior halving years, they essentially sold off right immediately. This was a concern I raised last year, but I said despite that, I do think that it will trend higher because of monetary policy. I think a lot of people think it all just has to do with sort of like the halving and that every halving year dominance goes down. But look at this. You can see that has not been true this halving year. It really justifies why talking about monetary policy is important. Despite the fact that the last 2 halving years, dominance was trending down a lot in the first, few months, that didn't really happen this year. Still suggesting that monetary policy actually plays a much more important role than perhaps people are willing to give it credit for. Now, here's where it gets interesting. And again, I have talked about this 1,000 times, but I think this is where it gets interesting because there's a ton of confluence behind the idea of dominance starting to go back up, especially as we get out into like the August, September through December timeframe. Okay, so first of all, by that August, September timeframe, I imagine if the spot ETF does launch between now and then, which I assume it will, I honestly have no idea. I haven't really been following the news, but I was listening to people about it a few weeks ago, and everyone was telling me it was going to launch on July 8th. Well, July 8th came and went, and of course, there's still no ETF. I am confident that it will probably launch soon, but I don't really think anyone knows exactly when it's going to launch, other than maybe just a few days in advance, right? Predicting it out of several weeks is very difficult as people show us. But what I think is fascinating about it is that there is this huge confluence about not only seeing strength by dominance in, really starting from day 240, from like the 200s, the sort of the low to like 215 to 246 into the year, days into the year. We're currently at 192. So basically just like 3 to 6 weeks out. Not only do you see dominance really start to go parabolic in Q4, but look at this. And I hope you are holding on to your hat, because last cycle, we saw dominance. We saw Bitcoin pairs collapse right here in June of 2019. Now, you might be thinking, what has been smoking? What the hell does that have to do with the halving year? Because he's over here talking about what happened in the pre-halving year of the last cycle. So whatever he's smoking, maybe I want 2 of those. How can this be the same? How can it possibly be the same? My point here is that there's a lot of confluence, because not only do you have favorable seasonality for Bitcoin dominance, excluding stables, in Q4. And again, I mean, if you're thinking about this right now, like we're in Q3, I'm not saying that it has to go parabolic right this second. Okay, I'm saying, look, as an investor, you want to be prepared for the next move, right? You don't want to be planning out what's going to happen tonight. At least that's not what this channel's for. And if that's what you're doing, if you're trying to use this channel to figure out what happens tonight, I got news for you. You're on the wrong channel. I can guarantee you I'd be losing money if I were day trading, especially day trading crypto. Okay, so the confluence is this, is that in Q4 of halving years, we have seen dominance go up. Both times. The thing is the last 2 times they went up, it was from a much lower level. What if Bitcoin dominance doesn't go down to these levels? Like, what if it just kind of stays up here? And then you get a Q4 rally, but from a much higher level than it normally is at that point in the halving year. That's how you could see the Bitcoin dominance go to 60%. But again, the confluence is not just looking at what happened in 2016 and 2020 and saying, oh, it's a halving year, it must go up in Q4. The confluence is saying, look, we can tell that in 2024, monetary policy has played a crucial role in keeping the Bitcoin dominance elevated longer than it normally would be. And the confluence is that last cycle, we saw alt Bitcoin pairs capitulate 1 month before the Fed cut rates. Alt Bitcoin pairs had their first monthly close below the range low that they had set about a year before, their first monthly close below it in June of 2019. And then it was in July that the Fed cut rates. It was in July. Fed cut rates. You can see that there was actually, the prior month, there was a wick below all the prior wicks, but it didn't actually get that monthly close. Just like last month, there was a wick below all these other prior wicks, but it didn't actually get that monthly close below. Now, that does not mean that this is the month where we have to see the monthly close below. It could be. It could be, but we're already almost halfway through July, and we're still, we're still seeing alt Bitcoin pairs hang out at around 0.4, 0.4, 0.41. Did they go as high as point? They haven't gone as high as 0.42 this month. Last month they went to 0.43. But again, the confluence is that, well, first of all, like this process here didn't take as long as this one's been taking right here. Okay, it's just been taking a lot longer for it to play out. But what I think is fascinating is that if you go look at this chart or this table, CME group probabilities for rate cuts, right? And again, these probabilities have been pretty wrong for the last few years. And I was very much adamant we would be at 5.5%, and that once we got to 5.5%, we would stay there for a long time before the Fed cut rates. But if you look at this, the market is saying the first rate cut is going to be in September. 71.8% chance of a rate cut in September. Why is that interesting? Well, last cycle, alt Bitcoin pairs broke down 1 month before the first rate cut. 1 month. Now, September, 1 month before September, is coincidentally August. Right? August. Which coincidentally is right around the time that Bitcoin dominance starts to pick itself up by its bootstraps and starts to gear up for the final move of the year. Because again, let's just think about this for a minute. We're day 192 right now. You can see that in 2016 there was a local low found on day 215, right? I mean, that's only 3 weeks from now, right? 3 weeks from now, which is in August. And again, that is when alt Bitcoin pairs might capitulate. 1 month before the first rate cut. I think it's fascinating. I mean, there's all this confluence for it. There's a ton of confluence. I mean, you have the halving year Q4 seasonality for Bitcoin dominance, coupled with rate cuts likely coming by September. So you still might have this move, right? You still have this move, theoretically, that needs to happen. Well, it's a market. There's no such thing as needs to happen. It's just that, and again, I've received a lot of criticism for this over the years as well, but, I think I'm actually approaching a point where I don't really care about these opinions that people put out about my views on alt Bitcoin pairs, because the reality is I've been very, very clear in my stance with alt Bitcoin pairs for years. Very clear. And it's been very easy for people to mock it and for people to cherry pick a certain altcoin at a certain time and say, like, look how crazy this is. But the reality is that alt Bitcoin pairs just put on a new low last month. So everything I've said about alt Bitcoin pairs for this entire saga has not been wrong. It's been true. They have just continued to bleed. It's just a lot of people don't really have the patience for it, right? If it doesn't happen tomorrow, they don't want to hear it. But I just think there's a lot of confluence here in the idea that you see year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin dominance excluding stables starts to go up basically day 230, 240. And we're already, we're only a week away from day 200. Meaning sometime in August, September, I think we'll start to see the Bitcoin dominance really start to expand again to the upside. Now, I think that's really a lot of interesting confluence, right? The halving year and interest rate cuts. We saw all Bitcoin pairs break down 1 month before rate cuts. There's more confluence. It's not just rate cuts. It's also QE. Okay? So when you look at QE, if you're looking at, say, like total assets held by the Federal Reserve, the balance sheet, if you're looking at the balance sheet of the Fed, last cycle, we saw alt Bitcoin pairs bottom out right around the time that the Fed went from QT, quantitative tightening, right here, this purple line, to QE, quantitative easing. Now, we still haven't seen that transition yet from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. They have let up a little bit, right? They've reduced the pace that they're taking assets off their balance sheet, but it is still technically going down. right? It is still technically going down. And so until that actually changes, my bias is going to remain that all Bitcoin pairs are going lower, regardless of the direction of Bitcoin USD. That is what my bias is going to be, because my view is just simply based on monetary policy as it relates to alt Bitcoin pairs. It's nothing personal with the altcoin. You know, I've had altcoins in my portfolio many times in the past, and I mean I still have, you know, some bags left over from prior cycles. I as I've said for the last several years, I think it just makes sense to focus on Bitcoin during a Bitcoin dominance rally. I can sympathize with people who maybe bought an altcoin and that altcoin is up a lot, looking at this video and thinking that it's completely ridiculous that I discount that altcoin and I just rule it out. I'm not really, but I think for every person that thinks that, if you stay in crypto long enough, I think a lot of you will actually come to a very similar view as me. It just takes a while to get there, because the longer you're in crypto, the more you just get tired of all the, you know, of all the scams and the rug pulls and all that. And you kind of recognize that, yeah, like you can make money in the altcoin market. There's certainly a lot of money to be made there, but there's also some peace of mind associated with just kind of sticking with Bitcoin, especially in Bitcoin dominance rallies, right? Especially. Now, you could make the case that when QE returns and Bitcoin dominance is potentially topping out and starting to turn back the other way, then you can make the case, all right, well, now you can increase the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio potentially by riding some of these altcoins that are drastically outperforming Bitcoin. But you can't really say that over the last few years unless you cherry pick some altcoins. Because again, a majority of them have bled against Bitcoin. It's just that we cherry pick which ones are outperforming to sort of make the case against it. So not only do you have, and by the way, Powell came out today, because he was doing some congressional testimony, and he said today that they have a long way to go for the balance sheet runoff. You know, they have a long way to go, suggesting that all Bitcoin pairs still are likely going to bleed for a while. So there's another piece of Confluence, right? And I'll try to do this video again on Bitcoin dominance a month from now, because about a month from now, we should start to see it really gear up and go the other direction. Like, you know, start to go back to the upside, I think. That's not the only piece of Confluence, right? You do, of course, you have the seasonality in the halving year in Q4, Bitcoin dominance. It starts before Q4, right? Really, it starts before Q4. You have that seasonality. You have rate cuts likely coming in September. Last cycle, all Bitcoin pairs broke down 1 month before. That would mean they break down starting in August. You have QE to Q, or the transition from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. Until that transition occurs, Bitcoin dominance, I think, will go higher. So you have 3 different things just right there, right? Just right there. The other piece of Confluence that you have as it relates to Bitcoin dominance is the social risk, right? So if you go look at the social risk, it's currently right around that 0.1 level, right? And last cycle, as it came back down and sort of just hung out at these lower social risk levels again, that's ultimately where Bitcoin dominance ended up topping out. But it took it took a while for this process to play out. And the reason I say this is one way to measure where Bitcoin dominance is going to go. How do you see Bitcoin dominance go down? You have to have an influx of retail investors, right? And you can see that on the social risk. But we're not seeing that, right? I mean, we haven't seen that. We basically just saw a long grind down, and then now we're sort of in this phase over here. We haven't reached the other side. Last cycle, social risk did not go up durably until after the Fed pivoted from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing, right? That's when social interest started to go back up again. And you might think, well, why does this make sense? Like, why do people wait for that? I think a lot of people, you know, the people watching a 1 or 2 hour video on Bitcoin dominance, or if you have the time, if you have the freedom to do something like that, I don't want to call it luxury, because it's not really, I mean, this is not really that luxurious to just sit here and listen to me give a tired, boring lecture on Bitcoin dominance, especially when you already know what I'm going to say. But if you think about it, there's a good chance that if you're watching this, you're in a very different position than millions and millions and millions of other people that might be crypto investors, sort of like, you know, passively, or they sort of buy some when they can. They're not like you. They're not just over here, researching all these, all these degen plays and whatever it might be. They're just the person who, hey, when they have some spare cash every once in a while, maybe they put some into the cryptoverse. But as long as monetary policy becomes more and more restrictive, those people that do that, they become fewer and fewer and fewer. And the people that stick around are basically just people that, were here from day one anyways, the Bitcoiners. And that's another reason why Bitcoin dominance goes up. If people aren't here to buy the altcoin bags, then Bitcoin dominance goes up, because Bitcoin just, there's only one Bitcoin. There's, tens of thousands of altcoins. And I've heard a lot of people tell me that, because there's more and more altcoins, Bitcoin dominance, they say it has to go down. Guys, just because you how do I say this metaphorically, right? Like there's only so many pieces of the pie, right? Just because you add more altcoins doesn't mean there's more money going into those altcoins. You're just basically diverting money that would have gone into other altcoins into new altcoins, right? But a lot of the money going into Bitcoin doesn't get diverted into an altcoin just because a new altcoin is minted by a seventh grader who decided to create a WordPress site and make a funny name for their meme coin, right? The money going to Bitcoin isn't going to be swayed by that. The money going into the altcoin market might be swayed by that. But if you look at Bitcoin dominance and you overlay it with social risk, right? Here's the let's go over to the workbench here and look at Bitcoin dominance. We're going to look at it without stable coins, and we're going to add on here the social risk, right? So if you look at let me see how I can find. I'm trying to remember where we put it. Maybe it's here. Yeah, here it is. Social risk. So you can see like the dominance excluding stables just trends higher as social risk is low, right? And so that's why that's another area of Confluence that social risk has really been struggling. And if you go over and look at a lot of the different social risk metrics, like you look at YouTube views to a lot of these different crypto YouTube channels, they haven't really been doing that great recently. It's not that they're hurting, it's just that they're more like if it ever loads, right? It's more so that they're just at like background noise levels, right? This is like background noise. This is basically like, the same 800,000 people that are watching these YouTube channels that were watching it last year, they're watching it this year. But you're still not seeing that influx of new people, right? You still haven't seen that yet. And how do you see that before rate cuts arrive? You probably don't. YouTube subscribers, to those same YouTube channels, it's a very similar thing, right? Again, it doesn't mean that, occasionally there's not upticks in YouTube subscribers to these YouTube channels. It's just that it's really hard to get people to follow crypto and all this other stuff when they're having trouble just paying their bills, right? Or if their altcoin is bleeding, maybe your altcoin's not bleeding against Bitcoin or the US dollar, but there's a good chance their altcoin is. Maybe that's how we can phrase it. It's not your altcoin that's bleeding, it's someone else's. But I mean, you can see that, it's still relatively low. So there's this other area of Confluence. Look at this. I found this kind of interesting. This is Bitcoin dominance excluding stables. Now, if you look at this, when we first had this sell-off of dominance back in 2022 going into the merge, it kind of bottomed out right here, or a first like major low in August. And then you can see how many weeks did it take, even though dominance excluding stables was slowly trending up, how many weeks did it take before it got a massive break to the upside? 31 weeks. 31 weeks. Now look at this sort of sell-off by dominance right here, December 2025. Dominance excluding stables, guess what? It's been doing the same thing it did back over here, right? Generally trending higher. You see the comparison? It's actually almost identical. How is it identical? First, it sells off below the 20-week SMA. You see that? It then gets back above it and then sells off again. Right there. All right, gets back above it and then sells off again. Then it gets squeezed between this trend line and the 20-week SMA, and then eventually it's forced to go up. The reason it's forced to go up is because monetary policy is still restrictive. So that's the bias that it's going to go. It's just going to keep trending higher. As it gets back above it, it then comes back down, holds it as support, just like it did right here. It then gets another bounce up, but then it comes back down and holds it as support again, just like where we are right now. 31 weeks from December 25th of 2023 is the week of July 29th. The week of July 29th, which is only a few weeks from now, right? Which, guess what? It's right before the week of July 29th includes August. Why is August important? August is important because that's when alt Bitcoin pairs broke down last cycle as it relates to monetary policy 1 month before the first rate cut, right? That's when they broke down. And that is when this chart would say that you're likely going to start to see another move up by dominance. It could be as early as August. I really do. I really do feel a lot of conviction about this, and I have for a long time. And, you know, if you look at if it makes this move to the top of the trend line up here, if we get a price label, that's about 64, right? I mean, it's currently about 59. This is excluding stables. So excluding stables, it's already at 59%. To the top of the channel, that's another 5%, right? Well, if you add on 5% to Bitcoin dominance, that basically gets you to 60%, including stables. Now, the other reason why I think 60% is a milestone that can be achieved, if you look at the fib retracement stuff of Bitcoin dominance, you can see that last cycle from the breakdown point, it actually retraced to the 618. Now, if you take the same thing from this cycle, from the breakdown point, the 618 happens to be precisely 60%. So then the question, if we agree, which we probably don't, right? But let's just suppose it does go up, which again, there's no guarantee that it does. Maybe I'm wrong. I get things wrong all the time. And if I'm wrong about this, it'll just be one more thing I'll add to a very, very long list. But if we just suppose for a minute that Bitcoin dominance goes to 60%, the next task is figuring out when is it going to happen, okay? Because just because altcoins break down in August, potentially 1 month before the first rate cut, which, by the way, there's still no guarantee they're going to cut in September. So there's always a chance that altcoins don't break down until, you know, October because maybe rate cuts get delayed until November. That's an option as well, right? That's an option. But let's just suppose that the view is correct and the dominance will go to 60%. It's just a matter of when. Then where will we be looking? My first candidate for that is September. I honestly, I don't think it's going to make it to 60% as early as that, but I think it could get to, like, you know, back up to 57, 58% as early as September, October. The reason why I say September is because there's this thing about Bitcoin dominance where it trends, it doesn't trend down or up in terms of September. Wherever it's going before September, it reverses course in September. So like in 2023, we saw Bitcoin dominance trending down into September, and then in September, it reversed course. In 2022, we saw Bitcoin dominance trending down into September, and then in September, it reversed course. We could keep going, guys. In 2021, it was going down into September, and then in September, it reversed course. In 2020, it was going down into September, and then in September, it reversed course. Keep going, right? 2019. Here's where I'm going to catch you off guard. 2019, it was going up into September, and in September, it reversed course. It doesn't matter which way it's going before September. It's just that whatever way it is going, it tends to reverse course. 2018, it was going up into September, and then it reversed course. 2017, it was going down into September, and then it reversed course and had a Q4 rally. Do you see the point? Whatever direction Bitcoin dominance is going into September, it then reverses course. So here's where it gets interesting. And I'm not 100% sure about this, but here's an idea. Right now, Bitcoin dominance, it depends on how you look at it, right? If you look at dominance like I do over a long scale, I mean, it's just been going up, right? I mean, look at this move. I mean, it's just been going up. Like, who looks at this and says the Bitcoin dominance has been going down? In fact, if you put on a monthly Heikin-Ashi candles, they've been green since December of 2022. And there have been people that have faded this entire move, thinking that they were right about altcoins, but in reality, Bitcoin has just outperformed the majority of the altcoin market. Now, you see that chart? Every single monthly Heikin-Ashi candle from now until December 2022 has been green. But here's where it gets a little tricky. In the short term, while Bitcoin dominance has been going up, right? In the short term, you could make a case that it hasn't really been putting in higher highs since April, right? So what if it's just kind of slowly fading into September, and then in September it reverses course? Now, wait a second. How can that be? Like, how can that be? What's been smoking now? A minute ago, I said that alt Bitcoin pairs are likely going to break down in August because the Fed might cut rates in September. Well, there's two counterpoints. First counterpoint, I don't know if they're going to cut in September. Maybe they don't cut until November. If they don't cut till November, then perhaps all Bitcoin pairs break down in October. Meaning September would be the time that alt Bitcoin pairs would actually break down instead of August. Okay, that's one option. That's option one. Option two, though, is a little bit different. Okay, option two. This is a weird thing. Okay, and I'm not coping. Well, maybe I am. But look at this. Bitcoin divided by total. So if you just take Bitcoin divided by total market cap, you just get Bitcoin dominance, right? It's rounded, right? I'm only having it out to 2 decimals here, which is why it's showing 55% instead of 54.52. But what if we cope a little bit? Cope with me here for a minute. Total minus ETH. So now what we're doing, we're looking at Bitcoin dominance, excluding ETH. We're pretending like ETH doesn't exist for a moment, which again, it does. And I do think it is the second, best after Bitcoin in terms of like your risk adjusted returns in the cryptoverse. But when you look at it like this, it tells a slightly different story. What story is that? You could ask. Well, if you include ETH, Bitcoin dominance hasn't actually put a new high since April. If you exclude ETH from the calculation, dominance just put in a new high last month. Now think about that for a minute. How does that work? How can that possibly work? How can dominance excluding ETH put in a new high, but dominance including ETH does not? Well, it's because alts have been bleeding against Bitcoin, but they've also been bleeding against ETH. And because ETH went up against Bitcoin, and ETH is a higher market cap than a lot of the altcoins, by a lot I mean all, Bitcoin dominance did not put in a new high, even though Bitcoin dominance excluding ETH did. So, therefore, you could have a scenario where altcoins break down in August, or they start to break down in August, but it might not be obvious on the Bitcoin dominance chart by itself because ETH Bitcoin still hasn't thrown in the towel. Now remember, last cycle, ETH Bitcoin dropped durably below the range lows 1 month after alt Bitcoin pairs dropped below the range lows. Alt Bitcoin pairs durably dropped in June of 2024, 1 month before rate cuts. ETH Bitcoin didn't drop durably below the range low until the month that rate cuts occurred. ETH Bitcoin dropped below in July. Alt Bitcoin pairs dropped below in June. So what that could mean is that, you could still have a situation where altcoins are capitulating against Bitcoin starting in August, potentially, but they're not yet leading to a much higher Bitcoin dominance durably, simply because ETH is still, as they say it with me, holding up well, right? As they say, because it's holding up well. But we know that last cycle, ETH Bitcoin broke down 1 month after alt Bitcoin pairs did. So if alt Bitcoin pairs break down 1 month before rate cuts, and rate cuts occur in September, that means that you might have alt Bitcoin pairs breaking down in August, but ETH Bitcoin might not break down until starting around September. Here's where it gets interesting. Hold on to your hat again. We've done a lot of comparisons to 2019, right? A lot of comparisons. And, in 2019, ETH Bitcoin broke down in July, right? Broke down in July. In fact, it was actually looking really similar for a while, right? I mean, you had this sort of this January, February top, just like here, January, February top. Then you had a May top, just like this May top. But the issue is that by this point in 2019, ETH Bitcoin was already back at the range low. It's not at the range low right now, right? The range low is about 0.049 and it's not there. I mean, it's obviously gone below that, but it's not quite there. So then we roll back the clock a little bit more and we see another example in 2016, which happens to be a halving year for Bitcoin. And what happened then? What happened then is actually a lot more similar to what's going on now with ETH Bitcoin, where it basically had a fake breakout below the low in the summer of 2016, just like ETH Bitcoin had a fake out below the low just before the summer of 2024. Now, when this happened, you can see that ETH Bitcoin had a very sharp move to the upside after that false breakdown. You see that? A very sharp move. And then it basically spent, from that point, if you take a date range on this, right, it basically spent from that wick back up 13 weeks in this range. And then it ultimately rolled over after it wicked above that initial wick up. You see that? When did that wick up occur? You're not going to believe it, guys. September, the week of September 19th. The week of September 19th. Why is that interesting? Why did ETH Bitcoin start to roll over? Why could it roll over this time, around that same time? The Fed might lower rates July 18th. Now, this is a different year. This is 8 years before. But you see this? September 19th. Go to this time. It'd be right here, right? Either, around the week of September 16th, the week of September 23rd, somewhere in there. It is what it is. But I could see that playing out, right? Where alt Bitcoin pairs break down in August, and then people are like, oh, well, Bitcoin dominance still isn't going down. But the reason why Bitcoin dominance or it's not going up, the reason why Bitcoin dominance might not be at where they want it to be, even though alt Bitcoin pairs are breaking down, is because ETH Bitcoin is still, as I say, quote unquote, holding up well. But then what happened? What happened after September? You had that Q4 seasonality by Bitcoin, where Bitcoin starts to do better than the altcoin market. And then look at what happened to ETH Bitcoin. From September until December, it bled. See? It bled. And then it bottomed out at the very end of December. And then in the post-halving year, you see what happened. So, you could have a scenario where Bitcoin dominance could be interpreted as sort of, going down into the August-September timeframe, because it's already been putting in, lower highs, right? This is similar to what we've seen previously, sort of going into that September timeframe. I think a lot of people think like this takes a long time, but it really doesn't. I mean, it's only, September's only about a month and a half from now. It's not really that long. But you could have a scenario where alt Bitcoin pairs are breaking down in August, but because ETH Bitcoin still hasn't broken down itself, the dominance, while it might still be slowly trending up, it isn't like durably above the prior highs. Again, look at dominance excluding stables. It's still slowly trending up. It's just taking, it's kind of like where it was back over here in February 2023. Right? That's where it is. It's kind of like, just in this range, holding support at the bull market support band. But the main reason it's going, it's not going up more is just because of ETH Bitcoin. Now, there's a lot of other metrics that we've talked about a lot that I think are relevant, one of which is USDT dominance, which I gave out plenty of warnings back in March. I said, look, guys, you have Confluence here. I know everyone was bullish at 73K, and the people that were bullish at 73K are absolutely praying that they can just keep posting, a bounce is coming, and then hopefully it comes. And again, I really do hope that there's more room for Bitcoin. I think there's a chance it could be a 2019 scenario where there's more room, but it doesn't come until next year, right? And between now and then, you might just see a series of sort of failed attempts to really durably put in new highs. But I think it's possible for Bitcoin to put in new highs, but I don't think you're going to see anything like that before the fourth quarter of this year at the earliest. And if it's like 2019, then it wouldn't even be until sometime next year. But back in March of 2024, I did a lot of videos saying, look, USDT dominance is at the trend line again. And, when it previously was at the trend line, Bitcoin USD and the altcoin market had a pretty big pullback. And now you can see that USDT dominance has really had that move up, which the reason I point that out is because it's helping the Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance trend higher. Because previously, this metric, the Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance, was trending higher, but only because Bitcoin dominance was going up quicker than USDT dominance was going down. But if you look at where, this is right now, it's right at the spot that it was just before rate cuts in 2019. And if you look at Bitcoin dominance plus ETH dominance, you can see that it's just kind of, it's been putting in higher highs and higher lows. And now it's nearly back to the bull market support band. But it's also, approaching that spot where it basically just went up a lot just before rate cuts in the last cycle. If you look at others divided by Bitcoin, which is, again, is everything outside of the top 10 divided by Bitcoin, you can see that it basically ever since 2024 began, it's been putting in lower lows and lower highs. You see that? And I can't tell you how many people threw this chart in my face back when it looked like this, when it looked like that, when it had this rally. And everyone was saying, well, look at these alts and you're fading it. But I'll tell you this, guys, last cycle, we saw others Bitcoin drop 60%, then rally 60%, 70%, and then drop another 60% as those rate cuts arrived. Let me just overlay US interest rates onto the chart. You can see it pretty clearly. So I say, why not again, right? You drop 60%, then they rally up 60%, and then maybe they drop that 60% again as those rate cuts arrived, which if they do, would take it all the way down to about 0.11 or so, 0.11, which is still a higher low. Get off my back, right? It's still a higher low, but in terms of a macro higher low from 2019, which is why, people say this time is different. Look, guys, I'm not saying that Bitcoin dominance is going to like 80% or anything. I'm just saying it's going to 60%, right? Why not? A lot of times when you get these alt Bitcoin bubbles, they essentially retrace to the point where the bubble began. And you could argue that it all occurred right here. And if it goes back right there, that's at 60%. Maybe it just takes 3.5 years to play out, which isn't that much of a crazy take. You know what's interesting? I've kind of found out, and this is a little somewhat anecdotal. I was talking to someone who's more so in sort of like on Wall Street in traditional finance, and a lot of the ideas that I was saying, like, yeah, like I don't know, like I've been talking about Bitcoin dominance forever, and these higher risk assets bleeding to lower risk assets, and how like it's such a contentious view in the cryptoverse. And I found out by talking to him, that it's really only a contentious view in the cryptoverse, because in traditional finance, a lot of that stuff is just taken as like obvious, and that's what happens during late business cycle environments, and that it's more contentious in the crypto space just simply because I think a lot of us here, including and especially myself, have not experienced a full business cycle. I'm doing the best I can to navigate this, but a lot of us have not experienced a full business cycle, and I think a lot of people are sort of learning it for the first time. But I think back to that, like sometimes I feel like these views, like I look at the chart, I think this is what's going to happen based on monetary policy. There's a lot of pushback for it, but I don't really get why, because this is just what happens. Look at like the Russell divided by the NASDAQ. I mean, this is just what happens, right? Like high risk assets just bleed to low risk assets during, higher and higher rates and quantitative tightening. Look at what's happened to like Lucid against Tesla. It's just the same thing. You see it across the board, where I see here Lucid's putting in new lows against Tesla again. right? But for some reason, when you talk about it in terms of like altcoins, people get upset. But it's guys like this is what happens in sort of these business cycles. This is what happens. So that's really why I think dominance is still going to go higher. I'm open to the idea of it still not really going anywhere durably for another month or so, especially based on sort of the seasonality and halving years and the fact that the Fed's likely not going to be cutting rates in July, which means the next option is September, which if all Bitcoin pairs break down one month before that, means it's August. And if they do cut in September, that means that ETH Bitcoin starts to sell off the same month that they cut, which would be September, which coincidentally is the same month that they started to break down that ETH Bitcoin broke down in 2016. So yeah, I mean, I think that can completely happen. And remember what happened in 2016 is ETH Bitcoin didn't really durably break down until it swept the prior high that was put in initially. Right? This high right here, it didn't break down until it swept it. And it didn't happen until September. Could happen again, right? It could happen again. Would be the first time even this cycle that we've seen that pattern. You know, a lot of these moves by ETH Bitcoin have sort of been like, you know, a 1-2 pop, right? You get a one move up, you fade it, and then you sweep it, or you come close to doing it later. Same thing happened right here. Over here, you saw the same thing happen, but in between sort of this move, you had sort of an intermediate top, right? So you kind of had the same thing, right? You have a high and then sort of an intermediate one, but you still could get another one that sort of, you know, comes close to the prior high after the launch of the spot ETF for ETH. And if you think about it, it could actually all be related to ETH USD as well, because in 2016, ETH USD put in a high in March of 2016. It wicked above it, a couple of times, but it didn't durably take out that high until a year later in March 2017. And look what happened in Q4. ETH USD sold off. So yeah, I mean that's kind of why I think this stuff, guys. I mean, I know it's not popular. I get that. And I feel like I have to say this. Like I feel like I have to, even though I spend like, the most frustrating thing about Bitcoin dominance is that basically it does its move really quickly and then it just kind of does nothing for like the next several months and it just fades, and then it just does these moves really, really quickly and then it just fades forever, right? The time that Bitcoin dominance is actually going up compared to the time that it's been fading is not as much. Right? It makes the moves up quickly and then it fades. So what happens is I bull post about dominance here. It finally moves up, I brag about it, and then it sells off, right? I'd say, all right, it's still going up. It finally goes up. I say, look at that, I was right, and then it spends the next 2 months selling off, right? Again, same thing happens, right? It goes up here. I brag about it. I'm like, look at me, I was right, and then I spend the next 2 months wishing I hadn't bragged about it because then it just keeps fading to the downside again. This process just keeps playing out over and over and over again, and I feel like we're in the fading process again. But I think it's going to turn around come August, September timeframe. If you exclude stables, it's already been trending up, so I don't get what the problem is. Again, excluding ETH, all Bitcoin pairs put in new lows, Bitcoin dominance put in new lows. Bitcoin dominance put in new highs last month, and all Bitcoin pairs put in new lows last month. So yeah, I mean, this stuff is, I think I really do think it's playing out. It's just taking a long time. Furthermore, if you look at something like the yield curve, remember it was last year and the year before when the 10-year yield rallied into October. I don't know if it's going to happen again this year, but I will say this. About the yield, about the 10-year yield. It has been putting in higher lows, right? You can see it. It has been putting in higher lows here. If it gets rejected, it might be a sign that the Fed's gone too far, right? If it doesn't get rejected and it goes up into October, recently, there might have been a little bit of decoupling recently, but recently, if you look at the dollar has been following the 10-year yield pretty closely. Now, the reason the dollar is important is because as the dollar goes up, that's less net liquidity. One way to visualize that is to look at go to the ITC. By the way, you can get these trading view indicators by signing up for ITC Premium. But if you go look at net liquidity, as the dollar goes up, net liquidity goes down because we're converting the balance sheet of these central banks from the local currency to the dollar. So if the dollar is at a higher valuation against those local currencies, that means there's overall less net liquidity. Now, you might say, what the hell does net liquidity have to do with anything? Because as far as I can tell, it hasn't helped anyone with the USD valuations in a long time. And you're right. And I talked about that back then. I said, look, guys, net liquidity is good for one thing. Two things, really. It's good for identifying when the jaws open. You can see the jaws have opened, just like they did last cycle, right? This is not new stuff. They opened last cycle as well. Same thing with the S&P 500. The jaws opened there too. But you can see, you can see how each cycle, I change it to a log scale. You can see how each cycle, right, at some point, the jaws open. And you can complain about it all you want. That's just what happens, right? Market doesn't have to be rational, right? Liquidity can go down, market can go up. Doesn't mean the jaws won't eventually clamp shut, right? But net liquidity was never meant to tell us the USD valuations, right? It was never meant for that. What it was meant for was telling us how high-risk assets are doing against low-risk assets. Now, if you overlay net liquidity with all Bitcoin pairs, it looks pretty similar, right? I mean, they look almost identical to each other. I mean, there's a few deviations here and there, but as net liquidity goes down, so too do all Bitcoin pairs. And if you look at net liquidity, you can see right here, if you connect the dots, it's actually fallen below this support. Alt Bitcoin pairs have not yet done that same move, but maybe net liquidity is telling us that they're going to soon. So I just can't help but feel like it's playing out, and not everyone, but a lot of people are just fighting it every step of the way, and cherry picking an altcoin here and an altcoin there to tell me, why it's wrong, right? Again, no shade to those altcoins that are doing well. If you picked an altcoin, if you got an altcoin a year and a half ago, and it's up a lot, I tip my hat to you. We're all here trying to make money. Let's be real, right? I have no problem with people figuring out different ways to make money in the cryptoverse. No problem with that. But don't use that one altcoin to tell me why this view is wrong when, 95% of the other altcoins have just been going down against Bitcoin. And if you look at something like the advanced decline index, right? If you look at the advanced decline index for the top 100 cryptos, you can see that, I mean, kind of like 2019, it's just selling off again, right? A lot of the altcoins are not, making that same move up with Bitcoin. They're just fading back. They're fading back down. A lot of them are, right? And I mean, Ethereum is actually below its bull market support band. It doesn't mean it can't get back above it, but you have some of these altcoins like ADA. Look at it. I mean, this is a 2019 fractal, right? I mean, is it not the same thing, right? Is it not? You get a big move up, you get sort of a double peak, and then it just sort of fades back down. Does this not look identical to you? Kind of looks the same to me. Look at DOT. What's it doing? It's been doing nothing for years. It's one of those things where, like, yeah, I mean, if you bought DOT at $3.50, sure, you're up some. What if you just bought Bitcoin for that entire time? Oh, look at the DOT Bitcoin valuation and get back to me. Yeah, look at it. Litecoin Bitcoin. What does Litecoin do best? Put in new lows against Bitcoin. That's what it does best, in my opinion. I mean, look at the chart, right? Look at the chart. Link Bitcoin. We'll see if it holds the lows. This is one that maybe it will. I mean, again, Link Bitcoin was able to hold the lows before some alts last cycle. I don't know if it's going to right here or not, but let's see. ADA Bitcoin. What did I say a long time ago? I said it's probably going to go to 400 sats. It just went to 550 sats. Imagine it bottoms there and people are like, oh, I was wrong. Guys, come on. This has been a downtrend forever, right? It's been a downtrend forever. These are the trends that play out. Look at Matic Bitcoin. Uni Bitcoin. I'm going to go back to Solana. Don't say I'm always skipping it. AVAX Bitcoin. I said back over here, I said, look, it's likely going to fade back to the lows by the end of the year. I stand by it. I would guess that by the end of the year, AVAX Bitcoin is going to be back down here, if not below it. The reason I say that, Dash Bitcoin is the exact same pattern that Dash Bitcoin had. If you were in crypto way back over here, you saw this exact pattern. You see this? It bounced in the early part of the halving year. And then by November, Dash Bitcoin was putting in new lows for that cycle. Kind of looks the same, right? It kind of looks the same. Maker Bitcoin. These things haven't done anything. BNB Bitcoin. It's had a bit of a rally recently, but it also just had a massive sell-off going into November. Solana Bitcoin. Okay, let's talk about this one. I was looking at this. I was like, this looks familiar to me. It looks really familiar. You know what it looks like? It looks like ETH Bitcoin. Just like, in the past. You don't know what I'm talking about. Or if you don't know what I'm talking about, look at ETH Bitcoin. Does it not look the same as Sol Bitcoin? Just look at this. ETH Bitcoin had a big move up. Then it had another move up. Sol Bitcoin. Big move up. Right here. And then another move up. Now, surely they didn't drop by the same amount, right? ETH Bitcoin from the high. 89% drop. Or sorry, this is Sol Bitcoin. Sol Bitcoin from the high. 89% drop. There's no way ETH Bitcoin drops to 89%, right? 89% drop. And then what happened is that then ETH Bitcoin rallied, right? ETH Bitcoin rallied back up, but it just put in a lower high. And you see this trend here, right? Like where it sort of did this like little distribution. And then it came down here. And then it slowly then faded again. Look at Sol Bitcoin. It's kind of doing something similar here. Right? What if it does what if it follows ETH Bitcoin? If it follows ETH Bitcoin, what it would mean? It would mean fading below all these lows that it's been putting in on its Bitcoin pair. Kind of coming back down here and then popping back up for a while and then sort of fading again. That's what it would do if it follows ETH Bitcoin. Again, you can't cherry pick an alt that drops 98, 99% and tell me why the Bitcoin dominance view is wrong, right? And again, no shade to Solana. Honestly, no shade. I think that it's honestly remarkable how well it's done over the last couple of years. Absolutely remarkable. But what I'm saying is these views that I expressed on Bitcoin dominance were back when the Sol Bitcoin valuation was, in early 2022, when it was way up here. And so what happens is, you put in a lower high and people say the Bitcoin dominance view is wrong. It's still a lower high, guys, until proven otherwise. It's still a lower high. Even if it was a great rally, and if you made money on this rally, I tip my hat to you. But again, the reality is a lot of the people that have done well were also buying Solana the entire way down, capitulating it here, and then bragging about it again up here. You have to be careful with alts. I'm not saying you can't make money, but you have to be careful with them. So you can see a lot of these alts are struggling on their Bitcoin pairs. I think the crescendo is coming up. I think it is. I think maybe alt Bitcoin pair. This is the timeline. This is my timeline. Okay. Subject to one to 2 month margin, right? But I would say if the Fed cuts in September, then all Bitcoin pairs start capitulating in August. Okay? ETH Bitcoin begins final capitulation in September. It could go up in September first, right? I mean, again, that's what it did in 2016. But at some point, it would start to roll over in September. So let me say in mid to late September, just so I get some of these people off my back. All right, this is what would happen. Then, if it continues like last cycle, alt Bitcoin pairs bottom in November. ETH Bitcoin bottoms in December. Why would alt Bitcoin pairs bottom first? Well, they did last cycle. If you look at I think they did. Let me double check that. Others Bitcoin, or sorry, total 3 Bitcoin. Total 3 minus USD Bitcoin. Maybe it actually bottomed in. Well, it bottomed in early September. Early September. So I was wrong about that. So you could see alt Bitcoin, but the issue is that some of the altcoins that I was tracking back then bottomed in August, right? They bottomed 1 month beforehand, but they also started capitulating 1 month before Ethereum as well. So I could see alt Bitcoin pairs bottoming in November or December. ETH Bitcoin bottoming in December. Could this play out? Could that play out? I think it's possible. I really do. I think it's possible. That's if the Fed cuts in September. If they cut in October, then you basically just, you shift all this stuff, right? Like, so instead of, if the Fed cut, I would just change it to this. Alt Bitcoin's pairs would start capitulating in September. ETH Bitcoin begins final capitulation in October. Alt Bitcoin pairs bottom in November, December. ETH Bitcoin bottoms in December, right? That's how I would change it. That is my view on Bitcoin dominance. I could be wrong. But you know what I see? The people that criticize this the most? What they do is they mock the view. They wait for alt Bitcoin pairs to get any type of rally. They dunk on me. They disappear when Bitcoin dominance gets another rally, and then they then bear post on it again. Because the reality is that you get a lot more karma from the general public for just bear posting about dominance, right? Because you can enjoy it for so much longer than the people that are bull posting on it. Because, again, you spend a very short period going up, and then you spend months fading to the downside, right? That's what happens. So you get to enjoy it a lot more. Whereas if you're bull posting about dominance, you basically get to enjoy the new highs for a week or two before then watching it fade for the next 3 months. And so that's the issue. I also see what I also see too is, they sort of they argue about it. They argue about these altcoins and why they're doing so well. And then when the altcoin market drops, they were all taking profits at the top, right? They were all taking profits, and you should have known that they were doing that. And then they're all suddenly Bitcoin maxis again. But the minute the altcoin starts to run, they all jump on the bandwagon again. The minute it starts to run, they jump right on that bandwagon, and they're ready to go with it again. And then if it's a lower high, and I put out warnings, by the way, if you look at total 3, I mean, look, these are lower highs so far. And I said last time, if you look at when gold broke out, that's what marked the top. The mid-cycle top for Bitcoin. Bitcoin did not put in a new low, but altcoins did. Last cycle, remember, gold broke out right there. And that's what marked the local top for alts. Alts put in new lows in the halving year. It was a pandemic, but it was, it was a recession. Gold, same thing, right? Alt Bitcoin pairs sort of topped right around the time that gold broke out. It's doing the same thing, guys, as far as I can tell. what more can I say? You know, I've made my case for Bitcoin dominance. I think it's going to 60%. I think it's going to 60% by December. I would say sometime between September to December. But if I had to pick one, I would say December. Just as because this whole thing has been taking way longer than I thought it was going to. So I'll just say December because it gives basically another 5.5 months to reach the target. And that's where I think we're going. One last thing before I forget. It's not a crazy idea. It's really not. If you look at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, I already talked about this. Look at yearly candles. Look at yearly candles on alt Bitcoin pairs. It's pretty clear what they do, right? They bleed for 3 years and then they get 1 year up, right? They bleed for 3 years and then they get one big move up. Right, here's one big move up, bleed for 3 years. One big move up, bleed for 3 years. We're in year 3. The 2 prior years where alt Bitcoin pairs went up, we're in post-halving years. That's next year. I've made my case. You can disagree with me if you want. I could be wrong, but let's just keep it respectful, guys. You know, I mean, the whole Bitcoin dominant stuff, I received a ton of hate on for so long, and I don't know why I spent so much time worrying about it. I mean, it is. I mean, now, even though these views have been correct, now it feels like a lot of people are stuck on the fact that Bitcoin dominance is back to 54%, a level that it took a long time to just break above. It just seems like it's turning it into support. So that's where we stand. I want to thank you guys again for tuning in. Subscribe if you're not subscribed. Give the video a thumbs up. The thumbs up do help. And also, again, check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We do have a sale going on. And by the way, we do a little bit more there. I mean, we also have 3 videos a week. We have an AMA on Thursdays. We have 2 other videos Sunday nights and Tuesday nights Eastern. So check that out. You also get the Trading View Indicators, Telegram Alerts channel, as well as a lot of other things. So make sure you guys check that out. Lock in lower rate. And I will see you guys next time. Bye.